大家好，我是老吴。本期节目想和大家分享一段非常有料、视角也很独特的访谈片段。说话的人叫约翰·桑顿。这位桑顿先生来头可不一般，他是前高盛集团的总裁兼首席运营官，在华尔街摸爬滚打多年，绝对是顶级大佬级别。但他又跟一般的华尔街人士非常不同，他跟中国的渊源非常深厚。早在2003年退休后，他就跑到清华大学经管学院当了全职教授，还是首位获此殊荣的外籍人士，并且负责一个全球领导力项目。他还在美国顶级智库布鲁斯金学会创立了以他名字命名的中国中心，甚至获得过中国政府给外国专家的最高荣誉友谊奖。现在他还是全球最大的金矿公司之一巴克利黄金的董事长，同时也在福特汽车、亚洲协会等一堆重要的机构担任董事或要职。可以说，桑顿先生是极少数能够同时深入了解华尔街顶层运作、美国核心智库思维，又能长期深度参与中国顶尖教育和政策咨询的西方人。这种横跨中美顶级政界、商界、学界的独特经历，让他看中国、看中美关系有着一般人难以企及的视角和深度。在这段长达20分钟的内容里，桑顿先生就分享了他对一些核心问题的看法。比如对于咱们经常在西方媒体里听到的习主席和中共，桑顿先生是怎么看的？他眼里的习主席是个什么形象？另外，他对中共这个组织本身还给出了一个非常不一样的类比。他还聊到了像一带一路这些热点话题，也顺便分享了他了解到的一些内幕信息。总之，桑顿先生用他非同寻常的经历和人脉，给我们提供了一个非常内部视角的解读。他看问题的角度绝对值得认真听一听，尤其那些想真正搞懂中国到底是怎么回事的朋友。好，咱们就一起来听听这位大佬是怎么说的。
Xi Jinping, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, I want you to keep your minds open for a second and try to imagine this. And some of you may know this. So Xi Jinping's father was the youngest vice premier in China in 1959 when he was 46 years old. And Xi Jinping was 6 years old. 1962, Xi Jinping's father was purged by Mao. So Xi Jinping, between age 6 and 9, his father's right in the center of the power structure, and suddenly he's out altogether. 4 years later, 1966, is the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping is 13 years old. The father and the mother sent to prison. 2 years later, Xi Jinping at age 15 is sent to the countryside, sent down youth. So he lives in the countryside from age 15 to age 22. So for those 7 years, those 7 extremely formative years, he's living the dirt poor existence of the Chinese farmer, with both parents imprisoned. Older half-sister commits suicide. So there's Xi Jinping in his teenage college years. By the way, of course, not being educated. There's no schooling, there's no university. And, where's his future? During that period, he applies 15 times to be in the Communist Party. He gets turned down 15 times. Eventually, of course, Mao dies. Deng Xiaoping comes back into power. Deng Xiaoping brings the father out from prison. Xi Jinping is now free to go to university and start his life. The father, meanwhile, Deng Xiaoping makes him the governor of Guangdong province. Guangdong province is the province right across from Hong Kong. And Xi Jinping's father is the individual who goes to Deng Xiaoping and says, we should make this a special economic zone, an experiment with market economics. So his father is the individual who goes to Deng Xiaoping and says, that's the kind of the first spark of the reform and opening period. Later on, when Deng Xiaoping essentially removes Hu Yaobang from power, and then Tiananmen Square happens, Xi Jinping's father is the only one of that generation who tells Deng he's wrong. And he gets banished again. So I want you to think about the sort of the strength of character of somebody who goes through what I just described and comes out the other side of it pretty much intact, stays in the system, rises up to the position he's in. I have 4 children, the youngest of whom is a sophomore in university. This past semester, he had a course on the Cultural Revolution. And the final paper was, write a paper on what you think the impact was on the sent-down youth of the Cultural Revolution. And so my son interviewed 6 or 7 sent-down youth, half of whom are living in this country and half of whom are living in China. And of course, in his paper, he basically says, look, you can't generalize for 17 million people on the basis of talking to 7, but these are what these 7 people told me. And then he says, you know, it's interesting to speculate, what was the impact on the sent-down youth of those sent-down youth who stayed in the system and got to the top of the system, like Xi Jinping? And my son says the following things in his paper, which I agree with. He says, the first thing is, if you're Xi Jinping, when he says our single highest priority is to improve the lives of the ordinary people, when he says that, this is a deeply felt, personal, emotional comment. This is not a conceptual comment. And this is not, you know, any of the U.S. leaders in my lifetime, none of them live that life. And so when they talk about improving the lives of ordinary Americans, this is an intellectual concept. They believe it to more or less extent. For Xi Jinping, this is a highly personal comment. That's number one. The second one is, if you live through the insanity of the Cultural Revolution, and you're a leader of China, priority 1 through 5 or 1 through 10 is social and political stability. So those 2 things, to me, are the most defining characteristics of this person. The third one being Xi Jinping's desire for China as a country to reestablish itself, remembering that in 18 of the last 20 centuries, China was the world's largest economy. It's only in the last 2 centuries, 19th and 20th, where it wasn't so. So in the Chinese mind, they're reestablishing the norm. They're not sort of in Graham Allison's phase, coming into a pre-existing system and upsetting it.
So one of the things then that I think it would be helpful for us to understand is, what are the policies that he's implemented and why? And you mentioned the number of countries that have remained neutral with respect to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. One can't but wonder how much the One Belt, One Road initiatives, which supported the trade both within Asia and China's connection to natural resources and the rest of the world economy through this initiative, have played a role in that outcome. Can you talk about what you see as the importance of what that initiative looks like?
Okay, well, One Belt, One Road is a perfect example of something. And I didn't know this until I was told this by John Kerry. So John Kerry told me that in, I think it was 2013, he was the senior American at one of these international meetings that Obama could not attend for one reason or another. And so he was the person who took the meeting with Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping in that meeting said to John Kerry, by the way, let me tell you about something I'm thinking about. And he laid out the One Belt, One Road. And Kerry said to him, oh, that's very interesting. Why don't we do this together? And Xi Jinping says, that's a great idea. Let's do this together. And Kerry came back to Washington, and he said before he got off the plane, the Treasury Mandarin said, cut his legs off, and there was no chance it was going to happen. So it never got to Obama's desk as kind of a strategic question. But I tell you that story because if you were reading today the characterization of One Belt, One Road, you would think this was some kind of malevolent tactic to get control of the world on the part of the Chinese, which it is not. It is exactly what it's said, what they say it is, which is to extend a model of development into as many countries as it wanted, who desperately need it. And when I talked earlier about Chinese modernization that I attended this last Monday, so Chinese modernization, I won't go into all the details, but there basically are 5 central characteristics of it, one of which is a peaceful world. Second one of which is common prosperity. third one of which is harmony between man and nature. So the foreign minister went through this whole thing, and then there were 5 of us asked to comment on it. And I said, in my comments, I said, listen, those of us who have ever run anything know, plans are one thing, execution is another. Execution is the whole thing. So my advice to you, the Chinese, would be, if you're going to hold yourself out as believing in these things, I mean, who's against any of these things? Who's against world peace? Who's against harmony between man and nature? Who's against common prosperity? Nobody. 10 out of 10 people. There's nobody in this room who's going to be against any of these things. So that's not the issue. The issue is, are you actually going to do what you say you do? And if you don't, you're going to suffer the same negative blowback that countries like the United States get when they were seen as being hypocritical. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, which is extremely important, and a point I want to make to all of you, which I made to the Chinese till I'm blue in the face very unsuccessfully, which is, when I first started spending a lot of time in China was I was chairman of Goldman Sachs Asia in the mid-90s into 2000. At a point in time when the Chinese system was just starting to open up, and they were just starting to put state-owned enterprises into Western markets, and Zhu Rongji was the premier, or vice premier, then premier, and he was a very unusual person, and he really cared about getting this right. And I happened to be there, and I was very senior, so I was in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to give him advice in a way that will probably never occur again, because the Chinese were so in need of advice. But one thing that struck me about them was the Chinese leadership, on almost every topic, not every topic, but almost every topic, was systematically open in the following sense. They started with the premise, there's somebody in the world who knows this topic better than we do. Let's get that somebody to Beijing. Let's drain his brain. Let's study what he had to say, see if it applies to us, refine it and customize for our circumstance, and then execute. And they did this time after time after time, which is why back in those days, you would have seen both Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji routinely meeting with Western CEOs, Western superb academics, Nobel Prize winners and so forth, Western head of NGOs. They met with them routinely, one-on-one, because they knew they were getting very high-quality information coming in from people who didn't work for them, and good information was coming back the other way. That started to stop a few years ago. That's another topic. But my point is, systematically open, except I said to them, listen, one topic you missed, which is the English language dominates the world's communication channels. And you recognize that. But you literally don't participate in them at all. So the Chinese story, as it were, is told by people who are not Chinese. And guess what? They don't know the story as well. They don't tell it as well. And so it's entirely absent. And until you start to get into those channels, you're going to be at a big, big disadvantage. So when you talk about Chinese modernization, coming back to that, if you believe it, number one, you've got to deliver on it. And number two, you've got to communicate it in such a way that the external world, particularly the English language world, takes it in and believes it. And right now you're failing miserably on that count. And until that gets corrected, it's never going to solve that problem.
So one of the things I think most Americans were taught when they learned about China was that it is a communist, originally Marxist form of government and society. But one of the things that many of us have missed is how not just embracing of markets China has been, but how dominant China has become at capitalism in its own flavor of capitalism in terms of state-owned enterprises and allowing for other kinds of free market operations. And the One Belt, One Road initiative is in many ways an expression of that. The incredible trade integration and market integration with the US is another expression of that. Can you talk about how that transformation has happened and how we missed it and what it means for China in particular?
Well, let me say a couple of things. First of all, I just want to read you one quick thing. This, by the way, another one of my pet peeves is that last November I was having breakfast in New York with a very senior Chinese official, just one-on-one with a note taker. And in the first 5 minutes, the official said to me, "It's so frustrating to us that senior Americans never read anything that we put out. Instead, what they do is they listen to so-called experts, Western experts, who interpret our documents for these, let's say, the senior people in this country." Mm-hmm. And he gave a specific example. He said, for example, Kevin Rudd, this is him talking. Kevin Rudd, who I know very well. He's a good guy. He knows China quite well. Again, Kevin Rudd's got a whole theory about what we're doing now. And a lot of people listen to him. He said the problem is Kevin Rudd's wrong. And I don't know how to correct that. And when he said that, I said, I recognize exactly what you're saying. It relates to what I was just saying a minute ago. But in addition to which, here I've got a book, for example, written by a senior Chinese, comparing the Warring States period in China with ancient Greece. So a frustration of mine is, as much as I know or don't know about China, and I know that an outsider to a culture can never be an insider. So the most you can ever hope to be is kind of a synthetic insider by building relationships with people. But one thing I know after all these years is that as much as I think I know on something, if I don't test it with a close Chinese friend, I'm going to be off. Sometimes a little bit and sometimes a lot. And so I tried as much as I can to read things that the Chinese themselves actually write. And by the way, this is an aside, with respect to the Chinese government, when they say they're going to do something, chances are very high they're going to do it. And in contrast, for example, to our State of the Union, which is basically a speech about the future and about hope, the Chinese have a thing they call the equivalent in China is the Chinese work report, which tells you exactly what they actually did for real and what they're going to do for real. It's a completely different document. All right. Now, I just want to read you one thing here, though, that sort of captures, I think, a very good sentiment. Bear with me here 1 second. Okay, here we are. The power configuration in the current world should not be defined as competition between China and the United States for hegemony. Rather, we witness a shift from the situation in which a single civilization dominated the globe to common prosperity of diverse civilizations. What China has inaugurated is not a Chinese century, but a century of diverse civilizations, a new era in which there will no longer be a single civilizational hegemon. And that's exactly the way the Chinese see it. As opposed to, Joe Biden says this is the century of democracies versus autocracies. Some of the funnier, more clever Chinese will say, no, it's the plutocracy versus the meritocracy. Which gets to the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party, the best way to think about that is the Chinese Communist Party is essentially the meritocratic elite. In the same way that if you look back through Chinese history, there was an emperor, and then there was the kind of the Mandarin class running the country. Mm-hmm. That's essentially what you have at the moment. And you don't get into the Chinese Communist Party if you're not very able. You don't get to Tsinghua University if you're not very able. 10 million kids a year take the national examinations to go to university. The top 3,000 of those go to Tsinghua University. Mm-hmm. 3,000 get admitted and 3,000 go. And so, and Tsinghua University accounts for 50% of the leadership of the country. So that the examination-based culture, which has existed for 2,000 years, still exists, and essentially, that's what drives the input into all these institutions. And so to put it in the vernacular, if you get to the top of the Chinese system, there's no chance you're not very smart and very able. Mm-hmm. And the only institution in this country, which is, to me, is at all like it, and when I tell them this, it drives them crazy, the only institution in this country that's at all like the Chinese Communist Party is the U.S. military, which is to say that if you and I were 18 years old and we went to West Point together, and we went in the military and we stayed in the military, one day we're 4-star generals. We've known each other for, whatever it is, 40 years, and we're sitting around the same table. That's the Chinese system. And so they know each other intimately. They've had real jobs. They failed or they succeeded. If they succeeded, they went ahead. If they failed, they failed. And like all big organizations, there, of course, is plenty of rough justice and infighting and all the rest of it that goes on in every corporation in the United States and anywhere else. But that's basically the system. So I think the word communist kind of gets into the mental way of Americans understanding what you're dealing with. It's not a communist system, period. Which doesn't mean they don't have, when they talk about common prosperity, for example, you might say that's the equivalent of trying to fix income inequality that we would talk about. But the other day, another Chinese was saying to me, the capitalist system is essentially a divide and conquer system. The Chinese modernization is a unifying system. And so so Xi Jinping, to go back to him, he is determined, although they haven't figured out how to do this yet, that common prosperity is for real. They're proud of the fact they've lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Of course, that's the most ever in history by a long, long way. And they're proud of that. And they think those people ought to continue to advance.
好，桑顿先生这段信息量巨大的分析咱们听完了，我认为确实是非常有料，也很有启发。他利用了自己横跨中美政界、商界、学界的独特背景，给咱们提供了一个非常不一样的内部人视角的中国观察。他对习近平主席个人经历和执政理念的剖析，对一带一路倡议意图的解读，特别是他提出的那个把中共类比为精英政治集团甚至美军体系的观点，都比较新颖，也挑战了西方主流对中国的刻板印象。桑顿先生的核心意识说白了，就是要想理解今天的中国，不能再用冷战时期的旧标签，也不能只看西方媒体的二手解读，而是需要真正去了解中国的历史，了解中国的领导人是怎么想的，了解中国内部的运行逻辑，哪怕这种逻辑和你习惯的完全不同。可以预见，桑顿先生的观点，尤其是他对中共和领导人相对正面的解读，可能很难被西方主流媒体和一些大众接受。毕竟就像咱们常说的，有时候你很难叫醒一个装睡的人。好了，今天的分享就到这里，欢迎订阅我的频道，咱们下次见。